Hi, everybody. I'm Laurie Cohen, along with Marek Korczynski, who's over there somewhere. I'm one of the editors-in-chief of WES. And I want to welcome you all here today. It's an absolute pleasure seeing all of you in person. And especially to welcome Kathleen Riach, who is doing our very first plenary. So you'll have read the bio, and you know that Kat is a professor of organisation studies and a British Academy Fellow at Glasgow University of Glasgow. And you know that she works in the areas of women and aging in the workplace. She's interested in issues like identity, the body, and all of her work has a really very fascinating social theoretical bent. So you know that we're in for a treat in this session in which Kat is going to be talking about her new book, which is about aging at work. When over the years I've reflected on what makes a researcher and the kinds of research portfolios that colleagues have, I've reflected on those people who seem to do research about all sorts of things. And I've thought, oh, I'd really like to be one of those kind of researchers. They must have such interesting lives. They're always doing new stuff. Things are always changing. How fascinating that would be. And then I thought about another kind of researcher. And that's the kind of researcher who knows absolutely everything about one small thing. And I'm in awe of those people. They know so much. Their expertise is absolutely remarkable. Those people are in a position to make a real contribution. I want to be that kind of researcher. Well, Kat is both. Take some of her recent publications. They range from older workers, to women, to menopause, to identity, to bodies, to lap dancing, to Halloween. And she's written all sorts of things, from the deepest, most profound theoretical articles to an information pack on menopause that organizations all over the world are using. Getting a little bit more personal, the kind of sociology that I really like best is the kind that Christina Nippert-Eng described as sociology that you can taste. It's that rich in detail. But alongside the flavor, I like research that really touches my life, but that also makes me think of wider things in a new way. And Kat's work does both of those things. And that's why I'm so looking forward to what you have to say today. So Kat's going to talk for about 35 minutes. I'm not going to stop her. She can talk as long as she wants. And then we will have time for questions. Okay? So I'll see you then.
Thank you, Laurie, for such a generous introduction. I'm glad that you appreciate the eclectic nature of my research, because I don't think our ref director really does when they're trying to write the narrative. First of all, I wanted to start by thanking the organising committee here for inviting me, and to everyone who's attending, because I know it's the start of term and it's upon us. So hope that you can enjoy this without having to kind of look at those phones from anxious students coming in. It's a particular honour for me to do the plenary here, because WES was one of my first conferences I attended in Aberdeen, and the paper I later published in WES in 2009 with Wendy Loretto. So to come to the conference as plenary is really a great honour, given it's been at the heart of what I've done in my own academic work. So as I feel my own ageing processes have been one that have played out through WES, today I'm going to take the opportunity to invite you to all think about how it feels to grow up and older in the context of working life. and how it's something that comes into sharp or soft focus at various points of our working lives. Now, you might have talked about age often or not at all at work, but you've no doubt felt its effects in some way. For example, noticing how each year the first-year students coming in seem to get younger, and yet we don't seem to have that same curse. Or you might have heard or made jokes about old dogs and new tricks, being as old as you feel, or you might have even stifled that involuntary groan when you get up after a long meeting from the chair. Now, all of these we experience and they're presented as truisms that often fuse together attributes and behaviours with the passing of time, and they slip out of our mouths without a second thought. The ubiquity of all these ideas surrounding ageing at work are passively swallowed, and we push them back into organisational life in the same way. We use them as shortcuts to relate, connect, or to understand colleagues. In fact, we only really choke on them when someone pushes them back onto us in ways that we don't recognise, that jars with our sense of self. This might also happen when we catch our reflection in the mirror, or we look at those pictures of a younger self that perhaps we accidentally come across, or perhaps wish that we didn't come across in some way. For this reason, Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote one of the most significant treatises of age in the 20th century, and that's not The Second Sex, which she wrote in 1949, but she wrote a book called Old Age in 1972. And she suggested that age takes hold of us by surprise. When it seizes upon our own personal life, we are dumbfounded. Now, part of the reason why this might be the case is that the ways that we express or articulate the experience of what we might call working through ageing, and I'm going to use this phrase to think about both the practical accomplishment of working through ageing as a form of labour, but also simultaneously the ontological project of growing up and older in organisations. And the way that we talk about this in workplaces is rather limited. But it's also that organisations seem to have a particular aversion, a discomfort or a dis-ease to discussing the fullness of experiencing ageing at work, even in spaces where age is central, such as retirement planning or age discrimination. Now, I'm going to suggest that there are a number of reasons for this, but I think they all oscillate around a particular quality of ageing, and that it holds a certain ambiguity that makes it quite a slippery target to hang anything onto. This quality means that anything other than a partial view of ageing is impossible. And yet it is because of this quality that organisations and institutions find it such a potentially valuable resource. And that is also why we are also so open as workers to organisations and institutions telling us how we might age and the best way to do it. So I've been researching ageing for a while, as Laurie mentioned, but one thing that's a constant reminder when you're researching ageing, and I know there's a lot of ageing researchers in the audience here, is that ageing is a universal, but by no means a universalised experience. It's a truism to say that given ageing is synonymous with living, and while we don't all age as workers, we all find that our ageing experiences are implicated and shaped by institutions and infrastructures such as policy, public welfare, health, media, and so on. So on the one hand, the we of ageing brings us into communion with a human experience that overlaps with everyone around us. But as Adrienne Riach talks about in her critique of race, the problem with we is that we do not know who we meant when we said we, and this is certainly the case when it comes to ageing. Now, this problematic of we all age in and around organisations can be witnessed here where we are in Glasgow today. So take a man who is 51, who lives in Carlton, which is just outside the city centre, and the average life expectancy in Carlton is around 67.8 for men. He works as a delivery driver for Domino's Pizza after an occupation injury led to him leaving his previous work. And in this job context that he's currently in, he's most likely to be seen as an older worker. This is compared with a man who's the same chronological age from Bearsden, which is around 7 miles away, but the life expectancy for men there is 83.2. And he's a barrister on his way to becoming a judge. Their life experiences of becoming and being an older worker differ in terms of their work trajectories, their expectations surrounding labour relations, and the way that work has marked their bodies and provided conditions for financial precarity or financial security. to the extent that it almost seems unfair that they will receive their state pension at the same chronological age, which will be around 67 come 2027, if they actually make it that far. Now, these stories aren't apocryphal. They're evidenced in public health and demographic analysis, and we can see where the intersection between ageing and labour, including non-work, work breaks, and precarious and unhealthy work, have a profound impact on our financial status, our health outcomes, but also how we are received and marginalised across the life course in workplaces. Importantly, they emphasise that it's not simply enough to say that we identify moments through particular age markers, for example, stereotypes, but we also actually need to think about ageing as bringing together a cumulative advantage or disadvantage in our socioeconomic lives. However, I want to suggest that we also need to think about ageing not just as set categories, but as an organising principle. This idea of organising ageing suggests that norms, expectations, directions and relations around age are baked into work and institutional dynamics in ways that are intimately but differentially experienced throughout our working lives. So, paying attention to this organising of ageing is central to this idea of working through ageing. It makes working through ageing a project that what Stanley et al. Would call interrogating the familiar as a site of oppression. And what I want to do today is I want to suggest that it helps us recover many aspects of growing up and older in and around the labour market. And it provides a way of articulating how organisations and institutionally sanctioned markers and indexes are both informed by and reproduce age-based norms and expectations. And central to this is recognising that they do so in ways that benefit some people and marginalise others, and more importantly, that we experience these mechanisms at the same time as being a dynamic, fleshy, ever-changing and temporally bound organisational body. So together, these features of working through ageing operate in symphony with each other, but they're not necessarily experienced in synchronicity, and at certain times we are situated as an ageing subject in ways that jar with our own perceptions of ourselves as an ageing subject. And the possibilities of how we can respond and negotiate to them depend on a variety of different factors. Moreover, these help us think that despite legislation surrounding age discriminations, despite culture change programmes surrounding age-inclusive programmes, and despite the increasing incidence of multi-generational workplaces, these elements of age bias remain persistent, mainly because the aspects that reproduce ageism and age inequality are not simply incidental to the labour process, but they are actually an enduring feature of the work landscape in contemporary society. In other words, normative perceptions of age and its corollaries are not simply a parasitic force that are in organisations that we can simply extrapolate, but they're intimately woven into how we think about and experience work in later life and growing up and older in late capitalism. So, to get to grips with this idea of working through ageing requires us to depart from age as a neutral or objective phenomenon towards recognising age and ageing as a process that comes to be objectified and neutralised, and what it enables age to do or to achieve in a variety of institutional spaces. This shapes how ageing and its related phenomena, such as cohort or generation, are correlated with particular organisational ideas, and they're manifested and become absorbed into everyday practices of organising in ways that sanction or close down recognition or alternative or legitimate ways of growing up and older and work. Now, to kind of try and flesh this out, I want to suggest there's probably three ways in which we can see these aged processes as constituted. And by aged, what I mean here is aged is a term that is similar to how we might refer to racialised or gendered phenomenon as a way to articulate the ways that divisions and preferences and biases are obscured, occluded, or written away in systems that seem to espouse a neutrality or objectivity, but actually and often have underlying agendas or logics that compel or constrain. So the first way in which we can see ageing is organised is ageing as controlled. Now, ageing as controlled sets up ageing as a phenomenon that can be managed, identified, and subsequently contained. Ageing as controlled not only sets certain conditions surrounding organisational duties and responsibilities surrounding ageing, but it affords systems of governance that enable some elements of ageing at work to be prioritised, for example, in terms of policy or socio-economic importance, whilst others are marginalised. However, it often has broader consequences for ageing at work because by representing ageing as a phenomenon that can be controlled through instituted organisational structures and processes, it enables ageing to become a target for institutional and management control. Now, this is not always for solely nefarious or negative purposes. For example, in launching a campaign to tackle ageism in 2021, this is one of the extracts from it in yellow and blue, the World Health Organizations and the United Nations jointly called for urgent action to combat ageism and better measurement and support to report and expose ageism for what it was, an insidious scourge on society. Now, whilst this is a noble ambition, what we actually see here is it's assuming this ability to fix ageing and its interlocutors, such as measurement or reporting, and it helps to suggest that ageism can be identified, isolated, extrapolated, and subsequently fixed quite simply. Similarly, we can see how classificatory schemes such as average retirement rates can become both systems of convenience and ways to shortcut how we understand people, behaviours, and in turn their perceived capacities, as we can see happens when we talk about younger or older workers and what they can and can't do. Numerical classification has been particularly powerful in helping to produce this illusion of ageing as a fixed entity that we can grasp onto and subsequently manage. I was reminded by this because it's my daughter's birthday tomorrow and she insists that she's 5 years old in 360 days at the moment. So, you know, this is really important and it's baked into how we think about ourselves from the beginning of life. Not only are we encouraged to read images such as graphs, not from the information on them, but from the shape that they make, showing us that there may be some demographic time bomb, for example. But chronology is used as a way to access resources and who gets those resources or who's the target of those resources. For example, it may be grants that you could receive for those under 40, or it can encourage different age classifications. Now, these appear commonsensical and immovable, until they're actually moved, of course. And a really great example of this was in the early 90s, where we had labour market policies across the global north, which were focused on activating retirement, so getting people into retirement to kind of make the employment figures look good. However, with the changing demographic patterns, when they noticed that this may be, you know, not the most fiscally responsible thing to do, there was a U-turn in policy, and practices that were seen as positive were all of a sudden seen as ageist. And the kind of extended working lives movement began from that. So this notion of controlling ageing at work also filters into managerial technologies that operate upon assumptions of ageing that separate it from other political and social contexts. Now, the limitations of this are often clear, for example, in forecasting. So, for example, many sectors, due to COVID, has seen the kind of art of workforce forecasting of older workers collapse because they're often based on historical figures and expectations. And yet at the same time, talk of these aspects is often couched in cultural ideas of looming demographic crisis, restriction of ageing to discussions of discrimination and ageism, and fear of unemployed and disaffected youth, the latter of which, of course, is built on historical notions of fears of delinquency in society. At the same time, age-based predictors become facts, and they're valorised and revalorised through statistical forecasting and predictions about the lack of capacity or skills needed in the workforce, for example. So it's often a case that we see when statistics don't add up, use more statistics until they do, and that will tell you what you need to know about the ageing population. So ageing as control garners momentum and legitimacy through emphasising a worldview that ageing can and should be controlled. And when this is breached, it often evokes what's called a felt crisis that relies on affective and emotional ways of encouraging us to actually seek or go towards those rationalistic logics and processes. In other words, it involves technologies such as demographics, quantification, and managerial cultures to bring together different constellations of policy, people, practices, and processes that both identify and categorise certain age groups as true and in doing so, legitimise the management, regulation and sanctioning of how we should grow up and older according to normative benchmarks or trajectories. Now, normative trajectories are also central to what we might see as systems of valuation based upon what we might see as an economy of ageing. And this is where ageing becomes, or organising ageing, becomes a locus of commodification in external labour markets or external markets, but also internal organisational spaces as well. One of the key underlying mechanisms that has allowed these circuits of values to operate in aged regimes has been this master narrative of decline. And this is the kind of historical idea that ageing is intrinsically a negative unidirectional process. The discourse of decline is rooted in biological and medical foundations, and it's long been a feature of cultural stories of ageing as well. And the subsequent response of this has often been that freezing or even reversing ageing lies deep in the sociological imagination as both a possibility and a noble, if not socially responsible, aspiration as well. Now, before thinking how this commodification might actually work within organisations, I think it's important to think about the historical imprinting of how ageing as commodification works as a gendered process and along gendered lines. So we have cultural images for a couple of hundred years in Northern Europe around things such as the old wives' mill. So this is the old wives' mill, and the idea is that men, usually old men, but they don't seem to get the treatment, come in and they put their wives into this mill and they churn them out, and what happens? They get a beautiful young wife at the end of it. And this is a really kind of culturally, a culturally common image in Central Europe in particular. But what we see is this kind of feminised commodification of ageing manifests in different ways as well. But it should always be achieved through authenticity. And we can see this in this idea of being your true self in and out. Okay, so make sure that you always look yourself in and out, but just, heaven forbid, don't look old. And this is a real promise of what is a $62 billion beauty anti-aging industry. And it's the whole point of it is not necessarily to be seen as young, but to retain ambiguity over one's age. What Molly Andrews calls the seduction of agelessness is the aspiration. By comparison of these various aspects, we have more kind of ageing masculinities. And ageing masculinities are usually around a triumph of man over nature, and it's often hinged on an immortality project. For example, around 100 years ago, there was an endocrinologist, Brown Sequard, and he self-injected an elixir made of blood and semen from various animals, and animals' testicles inside him. And this was reported in the Lancet in 1889, and he said that this had a rejuvenating effect. And this is a quote. He said that he regained all the strength he possessed a good many years ago. And he also talks about distances he could spurt in various ways. But well, we can discuss that. We can discuss that later on. Now, this, we can say, oh, isn't that cute? But it actually draws startling parodies with the assumption of youth and virility of power that we actually re-emerge through Viagra discourses, for example. And it's continued in the consumption patterns surrounding, in particular, Silicon Valley, where we see these men trying to trick mortality through various life hacks, and that also involves various bodily fluids and transfusion processes. And we also see it in these ongoing narratives around Trump and Biden. So what you'll see with Trump and Biden, you never see them just walk up a stairs. They always got to run up and down stairs for some reason. And this recent kind of shock confessional where Biden actually said that he might actually feel tired at some point, and these kind of heavy moral undertones around it. So seen in this light, what we actually see is there's this, to master aging is really the epitome of being able to control and transcend nature. And it's the final anthropocentric triumph, similar to what we might see in quite traditional assumptions or narrations of leaders, for example. But it also creates very lucrative markets, as shown in recent examples such as Unity, whose actual mission is to cure aging. That's what they say on their front page. Or Ambrosio, who was which was a former startup in Silicon Valley, and they were charging $6,000 for injections and transfusions of young blood. Now, Immortality projects are, of course, not an uncommon trope in organisations. If anyone knows who's had, a dean who's built a business school new building, okay? These kind of immortality projects are hard-baked into how we think about it. But what they actually do more broadly in terms of age is that they produce aged circuits of value that actually fit quite neatly into organisational logic surrounding power, heritage, and legacy. But at the same time, just as this is happening outside the organisation, we can see these ideas around how ageing can be commodified in more explicit and direct ways in the workplace. And a recent example of this is menopause. So while menopause can happen at any age, the average age for a white person is around 51 years in the global north. And that's around the time that ageism really starts to kick in many sectors. Now, for the past few years in the UK, menopause in the workplace has become a really kind of common lexicon to talk about in institutional organisational life. And the main justification surrounding this workplace menopause revolution, as it's been called, has been to recover employees' experiences of menopause transition and think about how workplaces can best support menopausal workers. And there have been some excellent inroads by activists and academics, some that are in the room here, to put this firmly on the organisational policy agenda in terms of supporting employees. However, at the same time, this growing interest has been accompanied by a growing for-profit menopausal market around training, consultancy, mentoring and thought leadership, as well as supplements, nutritional and lifestyle coaching, as well as specialist clothing such as heat control clothing, all predominantly focused on supporting women with significant financial means and cultural capital. To give some examples, we have in the medical field private clinics such as Newson Health, which is a multi-site private health provider that has an arm that funds independent research. Training providers, handpicked, have introduced an accreditation scheme starting at £1,500 and have organised menopause-friendly awards where the winners have often employed menopause training services and paid for them. While Gen M has positioned itself as a brand ambassador for menopause-inclusive products and has since published a report about the silence of menopause. Now, the commercial interest in white middle-class professional women as a market invariably informs their activities, embodied by the presence of their founders as thought leaders with a lived experience of menopause that they often share. And it's often supported by celebrity campaigners such as Louise Minchin or Davina McCall, who you can hire as speakers for, I think, between £6,000 and £25,000. So I'm just saying that's the amount that they got to speak. So. So now, this is not to downplay the positive aspects of this growing awareness, which is a great thing, but it's more important to critically and reflectively think about the process of how menopause at work has actually become commodified in a way that might actually be complicit or even actively reproducing problematic narratives around midlife women. Because, of course, what does a market need? A market needs a problem, because a problem is always needed for the market to solve. These modes of commodification, in doing so, reproduce a certain ageing aesthetic, one that is found in similar narratives surrounding the ideal worker, such as being slim, fit, and easily re-energised under the right organisational conditions. Presenting an acceptable menopausal body at work in this way is one example of how age-situated bodies are always experienced through day-to-day practices and systems of valuation that seek to maintain order and not disturb embodied modes of efficiency. So here, these menopausal bodies, as part of this ageing as commodification, are an example of how ageing bodies are part of what Judith Butler calls conditional access to the world. Even though part of their condition is that who we are and who we are recognised as being are never self-identical. More importantly, when these market-driven voices who represent white middle-class professional women become neutralised beyond their commercial interest, there's a danger that the selective experience of ageing presented in these narratives is a mistaken for the way that a majority of women may experience menopause, or a majority of how older workers experience the workplace. Even when we know that on average, a 50-year-old woman is more likely to work part-time in service, clerical, or entry-level jobs, have an average salary of around 30,000, usually works part-time, and can spend a significant portion of their life in ill health, as opposed to the 6 fitness videos that Davina McCall has made. So I want to move on to the third aspect, and I'm going to turn to the idea of ageing as conferred. Now, ageing as conferred focuses on the way that we're pulled into desirable positions in the workplace that are aged. These patterns of conferral operate through what Elizabeth Freeman refers to as chrononormativity. And chrononormativity is about understanding the way that we are implanted into a system that assumes that we follow the same unidirectional normative trajectories and timeline markers. Here, the idea of age and stage and expectation and aspiration all stick together. And they stick together various accoutrements that we might have around our work and life, designating both this idea of the right time to do something, and therefore the wrong time to do things, or the idea of what we should be desiring at a particular point in time, and what's appropriate or expected. They also allow for groupings, such as the concept of generations, to emerge and set up divisions that allow us to support treating people differentially, rendering our preferences generalizable, for example, on charts or infographics that organisations use. However, it's not as simple to suggest that these roles are created through ageing as organised through externally imposed parameters. One of the more challenging aspects of working through ageing is that we not only feel the impact of these aspects that circulate out there, but they are simultaneously felt in there as well, and rebound with our own embodied experiences of growing older, which is the trope, of course, that underlines Oscar Wilde's character in The Picture of Dorian Gray. So reflecting on this idea, we can turn to phenomenologists such as Merleau-Ponty, and this idea of this internal and external ambiguity that we feel that comes from our inherent interdependence on the world, where I borrow myself from others, but I also create others from my own thoughts. So working through ageing in this regard is an inherently embodied and relational project, something that is experienced in the embodied relations and connections that we have between people and within the organisations that we are invariably tied to. They also make us feel more or less ourselves at particular points in life in organisational contexts. And this kind of experience of ageing is making us feel more or less ourselves, is what de Beauvoir often terms the other to myself. So when we talk about the other in terms of gendering, we often assume a norm and then someone that's other and marginalised. But what de Beauvoir is saying is that ageing means that we always carry this other to myself with us. Nowhere is this more deeply felt than when we are misrecognised on account of the age that we feel, whether this be in terms of our capacities, our assumptions about our motivations, our ambitions, or expectations around how we should behave in normative or appropriate ways. And part of this unsettling feeling accompanying not being quite seen or quite acknowledged as who we really are is also about that latent niggle that in some small way, and within the force of these chrononormative regimes, there might just be a slight chance that that person who recognised us is actually right about us and we're not right about ourselves. Now, this, of course, is felt by different employees in different ways depending on their own embodied, situated context. Now, for example, a lot of people in the room will be aware of the term gendered ageism. So this is where intersectional axes of power come together and they deem usually women as being invisible or hypervisible and problematic. And this happens right across the working life course for women. So in the words of Wendy Loretto and Colin Duncan, women are never the right age for working. Here, chrononormative lines of implantation position working women as either too young or unconfident and with an excess of sexuality, too fertile and embodying the threat of the female body getting pregnant and disrupting the normative labour process, too distracted by caring, and then too hormonal and cranky. And these modes of aged positionality, whilst not true at all, not only impact how women are treated and received as workers throughout their lives, but they actually directly play into a woman's role in the workplace throughout her life, defaulting often to one of looking after others, because she's not enough just to be a one in herself. And this manifests in a variety of day-to-day workplace tasks or gendered expectations of how they should behave and how others behave towards them, perpetuating what Sandra Barkley terms a surplus nurturance. But these chrono norms can also operate in more subtle ways that narrow women's potential trajectories across the life course to not only be about just being a worker, but having to be, for example, either brilliant or absent. And one study that I undertook on hedge fund workers, so I interviewed people over 10 years that started working at hedge fund and interviewed them every 2 years afterwards, was that when we spoke to respondents who remained in jobs driven by the logic of financial capitalism, so they stayed in hedge funds or they worked in the financial sector, banking, property, consultancy, this notion of what Angela McRobbie talks about is of the spectacular feminine really played out through a particular middle-aged feminine subject position that emerged. Now, this idea of the spectacular feminine in a middle-aged subject position was a luminous presence who had managed to achieve it all, and in doing so exaggerated an evidence of meritocracy, placing in the shadows statistics that pointed to a continuing systemic leaky pipe of women dropping out of these kinds of jobs, either through not being promoted from leadership positions or leaving the sector altogether. But it also, as these quotations suggest, created a cult of perfection where awareness of falling off a precarious altar of spectacularity was part of a professional life for many women across their working life courses. And this compared to men who often joked about, and this is a quote, giving myself permission for mediocrity and still maintaining those safe positions in the labour force. In the same study, ageing masculinities also conferred across the life course through setting up parameters for appropriate relations that were also marked by class. So as they grew older, there was a growing awareness of the men that I talked to about being marked as a dirty old man. And this became more acute when the Me Too movement gathered momentum, as if suggesting that sexually predatory behaviour was the locus only of older men. Ironically, the impact of these associations was not disproportionately felt by men, but actually disproportionately felt by women, because men retreated into homosocial forms of cross-generational patronage and mentoring, whilst women had to undertake the additional emotional labour of making them feel comfortable enough to talk to them without fear of retribution, such as using familiar metaphors or being careful about how they approach them for support and guidance. Now, of course, there are a number of problematic elements to the politics that are happening here. But I think what it does show is that the dynamics of informal workplaces that play a role in progression and development are often supported or not sanctioned by broader cultural ideas surrounding normative ageing relations and how different bodies of different aged bodies can come together and connect in ways that are legitimate. Great. So to close with, I'm not suggesting that ageing is controlled or commodified or conferred are the only ways that aged markers operate within organisations and workplaces. But rather what working through ageing allows us to do is allows us to pay attention to some of the mechanisms that lubricate these organising processes, highlighting how aged structures and norms can enable or forefront particular ways of thinking and feeling and organising ageing at work, whilst precluding and silencing others. This embeddedness enables economies of value to be based on past, present and future potential practices, and to ascribe differential systems of investment and resourcing to different employees and their bodies. And these in turn legitimise the unequal allocation of resources, not least by concentrating, for example, leadership development opportunities on younger cohorts, positioning them as the future rather than the past. In other words, work does not shape the ageing experience, but work itself is constituted by normative assumptions about the ageing processes that shape the way work comes to be organised and experienced as an everyday phenomenon and as a structural force that can be seen as what one of my colleagues referred to as a mode of aged capitalism. Now, I recognise depending on where you're sitting or how you're sitting or who you're sitting next to or sitting around, this is perhaps a slightly more or less depressing idea. So I don't want to leave you on too depressing a note, because I think despite all these kind of aged regimes stacked against anyone's favour, because we might not be the right age, there is no safe age to be in aged capitalism. Organising ageing is not absolute. Rather, the organising regimes that working through ageing rest upon, whilst pervasive and seemingly intractable, are unsteady, and they're more contingent than many organisations and institutions would like. And hopefully, paying attention to them, not only in our practical accomplishments around being an ageing worker and the everyday activities and workflow practices, but in the way we pay attention to policies, cultures, and institutional structures as aged, we can allow recognition for that fuller, more generative ways of growing up and older, and allow us all to recognise structural disadvantages whilst thinking about ageing as something that has a generative potential to emerge and to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've got about 15 minutes, just short of 15 minutes for questions.
Hello. Do you want me to introduce myself or just...
Yeah, on you go.
I'm Matthew Cole. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sussex. Thanks for this presentation on aging. I've been unfortunately thinking about aging a lot myself lately. I kind of gathered, it's very sociological. There's a lot of interesting facets of it, but it struck me as maybe leaving out a big part of the advantages of aging and the sort of institutional advantages that one has as one ages, and particularly the demographic crises that we see in terms of falling birth rates and the fact that boomers and younger boomers are still largely in the sort of institutional positions of power that shape who gets what resources, and essentially most of that's giving them, they've already extracted that, whether it be free education or redistributive policies. So I'm wondering where this sort of fits in your analysis of the workplace and the different sort of commodification aspects of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist, so I wouldn't be researching something if I didn't think there was something good about it. And when we talk to people about ageing, it's the secret is it's not as bad as everyone thinks. As much as the markets want to tell us. So I think you're right in terms of that there is a huge narrative around different groups in workplaces in the labour market. So just last night there was something about the triple lock pensions, and the kind of the fear that this might be changed in some way. I think there's two aspects that I'd perhaps say to that. I think the first one is I'm always very cautious when we start pitting generations against each other. Because I think there's a lot of people that have high stakes involved in that, in terms of saying, well, this generation had it so good and we don't have it so bad. So I'm always kind of quite fearful of doing that, particularly because we know that various indices surrounding kind of quality of life and so on and so forth are actually increasing kind of in a broad scheme. So I think that's the first aspect. We've got to be careful in terms of how we think about what those groups we're comparing it against. I think the second aspect is that you're absolutely right that we have certain groups, the over 50s, in a different position compared to, say, the under 30s in the labour market. But I think one of the aspects is what we see is that no one is really safe in this labour market. And what we find is in times of economic vibrancy, we get a lot of promotion of what older workers can be and how we value that experience. But when we actually start digging deeper, those notions of capital, age capital that they have surrounding experience or surrounding value, are actually quite empty signifiers. So organisations may say that they value them until they don't need them anymore, and then they just clearly evaporate. But what I would say is, as I said, this idea that ageing does bring doom or gloom is not something. It's something that certain people profit from and organisations profit from, and I don't think that's the case at all. So thanks.
Okay, another question, 2 in the middle there.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I wondered if you could say a little bit about this kind of rhetoric around ageing as... God, this is the thing about ageing, is that I've completely forgotten what it was I was going to say. Honestly.
I didn't ask her to say that. She's not planned to,
God, you do your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Salih, a PhD candidate in University of Essex Sociology. The thing that I found with my research project is aged local journalist, aged like over 50s, who hasn't adapted to digitalized skills, to devices, are insecure, and they pushed out to the labor industry. They are not journalists anymore, they are Uber drivers. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I realized in the UK is the age of the average age of total population is 41. The population is aging. So what's going to be next? What's going to be, how we are going to protect the youngest as well? There is no younger in the labor industry. As you say, no one is secured in this labor climate. So what is your comments about this?
I thought you were going to say, what's your solution? I was like, no.
For some tips to analyze my data.
I mean, this idea of kind of, people reaching their expiry date is, that's kind of, it's been discussed for a number of years now, broadly in terms of a modernisation thesis. So, so the idea is kind of, in the 70s, the skills that you had were then kind of became outdated and so on and so forth. And these kind of tropes around adapt or die and these aspects have been around for a while. Julie McMillan's work talks about generational habitus, and I think that's really interesting. She talks about IT workers, and you'll know this, and she talks about this idea, that it's not that we have a kind of habitus, and it's not that we have a stereotype that older people are bad at things and younger people are good, but there's a kind of certain set of socialisation that happens for particular groups, and I've always found that really useful. But I think one of the things, I do some work with the Scottish Government around ageing, and one of the things that we're not very good at is being age inclusive in how we develop individuals. So so we say, oh, older people are terrible with this IT change, and then we realise, well, who's actually developed the program or designed the program that's facilitating the IT change? Who wrote the instructions? Who did all this? Well, it's someone who has that generational habitus of a 21-year-old who's a digital native as opposed to someone else. So what you find is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course they're not good because the tools and resources you've given them are actually age exclusive in some way. So I think to speak to your question, I think one of the really important things is that we start thinking about those more subtle and indirect ways of how the resources and the materiality of life is actually aged in what we produce and what we provide our workers with. So yeah.
So much.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have a question? Yeah.
Remembered my question.
Okay.
So it was about this idea of that sometimes older workers are perceived as kind of inflexible and not liking change, and I have to admit to that myself. When you see yet another restructuring and you think, oh my God, they're going back to how it was, several decades ago. But the counter to that is you see job adverts where they're looking for somebody who's kind of innovative and dynamic and energetic. So I wondered sort of how prevalent you thought that was, and whether there were kind of ways of countering some of the rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been a preference for green workers, isn't there? Like workers who are like a blank canvas that we can kind of impose any ideology we wish, and they're going to kind of passively swallow it. And I guess the nature of a cumulative biography is that if you've went through 10 restructures, you're probably going to be more cynical than someone who's just went through one restructure. And that's not necessarily about age as such. It's actually about the passing of time and like how we're temporally embedded in organisations. I think stereotypes are very convenient classificatory systems to dismiss people, and what I often see is that that's how they're used. So I think on the one hand there are reasons where those behaviours might arise that are located in a temporal trajectory or biography of an individual, but on the other hand that's actually needs to be separated out from a concept of age as chronology or age as stereotype or a subject position. So yeah, but good question. It was worth it. It's worth remembering. So, yeah.
I'm Zaasizi from Grenoble University in France. If I can ask this kind of thing, how old are you? And does your age has an impact on your vision of these themes? I mean, how do you evaluate, in fact, the impact of time on your researches and also on yourself as a researcher? Thank you.
Yeah. I know. Read my Tinder profile. No, I'm kidding. So I think chronologically, I'm 42 years old. Sometimes after a bad day, I feel like 60, and other times when I've been drinking, I feel 27. And I think what's interesting is, on a personal reflection that you've afforded me, what seems to be happening is this is the kind of crux of when you're researching something where you gradually move towards something that perhaps you've been researching. So I started researching aging when I was 22. When people ask, why are you so interested? Why are you so interested? You're so young. And I'm like, oh, I know. No one says that anymore. So, so I've had to kind of move on to menopause. And then, when I started researching menopause 10 years ago, everyone's like, why are you interested in that? You're not menopausal. I'm like, oh, no one says that anymore. So I think there's something interesting reflexively about how people connect with us that's interesting in terms of data collection. And one of the lovely things about doing a 10-year study is you actually grow older with the people that you research. And it's a lovely experience. It's a really generous and honourable experience for someone to let you into your lives like that. What does that mean for aging? I think what it picks up is probably this inherent ambiguity about aging, okay, where just when you think you're grasping it, it slips away from you. Just when you think you know what it is, it grasps away from you. And I'd like to think that's not because of my limitations as a researcher. I think it's actually to do with this notion that de Beauvoir talks about in terms of the inherent ambiguity of what aging is and how we come to receive it and how we come to put it back in the world. But again, as a researcher, that's a really fantastic thing to be able to look at. Something that that you're never going to fully understand, but you can have some fantastic and really intellectually enriching experiences trying. And I think probably for me, that's what my research has been, but also that's what kind of carries the promise of aging as well and the intrigue of aging as well. So, yeah.
So with that, we've moved smoothly from public issues to personal troubles. So thanks so much. It's been a great session.